post it as it is. I figure if people can't listen to it, fuck them, like that's my viewpoint.
Exactly. No, I do agree. And that's like one of the things I like doing these conversations, and I do like having podcast episodes. But the worst thing is all the posts. Like people try like thinking, like you said, people want to actually read what the podcast is about before they listen to the podcast. Just press play, give it 10 minutes. And if you don't, then just go to the next one. Like it's absolutely fine.
Exactly.
And I think I had done I remember there was a podcast I got brought onto years ago. It was quite a popular speed-based one. And I did 2 meetings before I got on the podcast. It was like, send me a set of questions. Then I had to then review the answers, then do the next meeting to okay it. And I'm like, this is 3 podcasts. Just press the red button. The big shiny red button, press it. We'll talk. We'll just
record this shit. Exactly.
Yeah. Exactly, mate.
It's not rocket science, my friend.
No. It's how the S&C industry can absolutely bodge just a normal conversation like they bodge most other things, So there has to be a technical term for this.
It's an affordance. We have an affordance for our
There you go. That's the one. So now what the software does is it just gives a nice summary, and it will say Sam had Scott on his podcast, and they talked about this and some key points, and then so people can read that, and then as you said, if they don't, they can just fuck off. Basically, we did we had the legacy retreat, so the mastermind that I host. We had the legacy retreat and we do a live podcast. But last year we did it earlier in the day. This year it was about 5 p.m. and everyone had been drinking for about 6 hours.
Then you get some really good conversations. Yeah.
Oh God. Yeah. Like it was so funny because
then you need your assistant to put the bleeps in and everything.
Edit
it out.
Edit. And it got wild because it was like we had done improv, so like improvised acting and stuff like that, and that kind of loosened, and people were so embarrassed to give them a couple of beers before they start, and then they kind of get into it and and then it's like, right, now we're going to do a podcast and you can tell me what you really think.
That's awesome.
So you just came off a speaking tour, right? You did all your workshops?
I've done a few this spring, but I was in Florida for a Perform Better Summit a couple weeks ago, and now we're teaching about once a month now through the fall, which is the pace that I like. You go and do one weekend, you teach, and the rest of the time you're marketing and content building and all that shit. So yeah. I didn't think at my age I'd be doing as much work as I'm doing now, but it seems to be you gotta work. You gotta plow the fields, if you want the plants to grow, so to speak.
Yeah. The work changes, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's like, and I think that we do end up having a little bit of an addiction to work.
No kidding. Way too much. Yeah. I'm actually not bad now. I've done a lot of personal, the stuff with Brian and things, a lot of mindset work around, why am I doing what I'm doing and where am I? And now I think most of what I do because it's in my heart, and I'm connected to my family more. But you can find yourself, writing or podcasting or, journaling or whatever the things are that you're doing, way more than you probably should be. So it's funny that way. But yeah, I think I have a better balance in my life now than I did 10 years ago, for sure.
Yeah. No, I saw a statistic recently. I think it was today. Someone posted about it, and it's just actually moved. When everyone says like I read something, I saw something, it's social media now. Like it is. So people want to give themselves like a bit of authority. Go, I read this thing. No, you're on the toilet. scrolling. But this guy, he was like the statistic that he quoted though was 60% of all NFL coaches are divorced.
Wow.
Staggering, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
I was just like, yeah, that's frightening, but I'm not surprised.
I had a friend of mine who mentored me years ago that one of the best pieces of advice he ever gave me was, and I was too late to take it, but he said, no man should get married before they're 30. And I think there's a great deal of truth in that.
Yeah.
I think, unfortunately, sometimes we get sort of into this belief system that we got to settle down and do stuff, but you get married and you don't really know who you are yet before you're 30 and what you really want to make happen. And so all of a sudden you start trying to change or trying to steer the boat in a different direction, and your partner's like, where the F are you going, or what's your plan, and most men are Neanderthals when it comes to communicating anyways with their partners. So their partners are kind of out in the middle of la la land trying to figure it out, right? Then drop shipping a couple of kids in that framework, and it gets really kind of awkward, so. But you look at an NFL coach. I mean, you can't be. Unfortunately, it's a job that has no grace point or time for. I don't know why people are sending me texts all the time. I have do not disturb on. I don't know why it's making noise now.
Oh,
sorry about
funny.
that.
No, you're good, man.
Anyways, yeah, it's a ceaseless job. Having watched pro coaches in hockey, same in the NFL, like. There's always something to do, right? And there's always this arms race of somebody else over there is doing more than I am, so I better do that, and the funny thing is we started all this stuff that we do now, the internet, the email, the text, it was all supposed to save us time. I mean, when you go back to the beginnings of this stuff, when you have email, you won't have to write a mail thing and wait. You'll be able to save time and get the point made very quickly and da 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 da. And now it's like everybody's viewpoint is they're in your pocket all the time. Text.
Yeah.
Oh, you should. How come you didn't answer my text? And how come you didn't read that thing yet, or didn't you see that? And you're just there's this constant. I got to keep up. I got to keep up. I got to keep up sort of feeling,
That was a big breakthrough for me when, because you do I used to, I mean, it's down. I've got about 100 odd unread WhatsApp messages. I was talking about this yesterday to someone, and it used to be like, I used to preface conversations with people by saying that to give myself leeway. Like, I'm not going to reply. And the real reason is I've got better shit to do. Mm-hmm. And it's not that I don't not respect you, but I have to put myself first. And with someone, and I had do you use WhatsApp?
Yeah,
I've got WhatsApp Business and put an autoresponder on it, so it just triggers off to people like, this is an autoresponder. You tell them, and you just see plain and clear, I'm contactable between 9 and 4, and someone's like, do you work at all? Yes. Between 10 and 3. And it's like, what? And then, people will fire back. And I remember this one point, it's the boundary side of things. I remember saying to this coach I was meant to be doing a bit of work with, and I was like, mate, my phone is for my convenience, not yours. I didn't pay $1.5 grand for this iPhone so you could piss me off. And he was like, exactly. 3 weeks later, it's like, that really annoyed me when you said that.
Yeah.
And
I'm not worried about that.
yeah, exactly. And that's the point, isn't it? One day I'm going to sit down with a comedian and just talk about coaches. And I think it will be the funniest thing ever what they come back with. I think it could be great. Be great.
Yeah. No, coaches we're an interesting breed.
Yeah.
For sure.
And you started in the NHL, didn't you?
No, my career started after I got certified as an AT as a clinical athletic therapist. I was working in a
Oh,
clinic in Montreal for a couple of years.
yes.
And then in those days, in Canada anyway, strength and conditioning wasn't really a thing yet. It was kind of in the beginnings. And I just discovered, well, I had always lifted weights
Mm,
because I played football and had an interest in it. And then I discovered the NSCA one day just by happenstance, and then saw they had a certification. So I went and did the certification. This would be 1989. And then it just happened that the university where I'd gone to school, they didn't have a formal strength coach position. They had an O lineman from football who was kind of, retired and coaching, was kind of giving the football team the strength program. And so the head therapist who I'd worked with was a friend of mine. He wanted to create an assistance role. And so
hmm
he reached out to me, and then I said, well, why don't we create a combined role, a strength coach and AT? And so then that was kind of the beginning of my career. I did that for 8 years at a university, and then I got into the National Hockey League.
Nice. Good
Yeah,
way in. That's
yeah,
a good
it was.
way
Yeah, well, I cut my teeth in a lot of different sports, and
in.
it's funny, in my career when I started, I was the university football guy, then I was a hockey guy, then I was the Olympic guy, and now I'm the ski guy, then you're the reconditioning guy, you're all these guys,
Yeah.
It's kind of I'm a mix of all those things, depending on where I was in my life.
Yeah. And that's one of the conundrums that come across a lot of the time, like that identification with role and like what the significance of that is, but it has to change. And that's, when no, you've got a curious mind as well. It's like at some point it has to change, doesn't it? And at some point, I look at coaches that would sit in the same job or go from head coach to head role to head role, and they'll do it for 30 years. It's like, what haven't you learned?
Mm-hmm.
What have you missed? Where have you missed?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's the same. Maybe the weather changes.
Yeah, I always like the
Oh,
Ali quote, where a man at 50 who looks back upon his last 20 years of life and hasn't changed, it's something to that effect, has wasted 20 years. So
yeah,
I think we're put on the earth to evolve, right? It's a
yeah,
reiterative process where you're rebuilding yourself and looking back. And that's kind of what I teach in my own mentoring program, is kind of just, why are you doing what you're doing? And then every so often kind of look back and say, well, this is where I am, this is where I've been, this is where I want to go. How
mm,
do I want to change? How do I want to grow? And kind of, work on that, rather than just, do the same shit different day over and over again.
yeah. It's like that. Like, do you not just want more for yourself? Is this standard good enough for you?
Right.
Is 25K a year good enough for you? Which is the national average salary of strength and conditioning in the UK.
Wow. Really? Wow.
Yeah.
That's
And then
crazy.
you'll get the guys that sit at like head of departments and all of those sort of stuff, and then they'll just stay. There was one guy who was in a Premier League football team and he'd been there for like 15 years. Well, no shit. Shock. What why he's gonna do everything he can to keep that job.
Mm-hmm.
So there's like
Well,
this ceiling.
to your point,
Whereas
then you get into that sort of protectionist strategy of how you're gonna not get fired, rather than how you're gonna be innovative. And
yeah.
that's kind of the reason why I got out of pro hockey, because I'm a change agent kind of person. I like to innovate, and
Mm,
unfortunately, that's not necessary. The funny thing about pro sports is it's not what you expect it to be from that perspective. You would expect it to be innovative and progressive, and let's see how we can be cutting edge. And in fact, it's very conservative and protective, and
mm,
oh, they're doing that, so let's copycat that, and da 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 da. And the
yeah.
number of people who are really innovative is few and far between. And
Mm,
and then everybody talks about the ones who had the special kind of outcomes, but there's the ones who died at the grapevine because they kept trying new things, and oh, you didn't win, so F you, you're fired. And so
Yeah.
it just
Yeah.
it reinforces being conservative,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
without a doubt. And one of the, I kind of look, I love the history of strength and conditioning, and how lots of things evolved from the former Soviet Union, and the Mount Rushmore of strength and conditioning coaches, or athlete preparation specialists, or whatever you want to call them. But you look at and you take these founding principles, and then you look at a lot of problems that modern day coaching suffers with. People still don't understand volume.
Mm.
Still don't understand how to use volume properly.
Mm.
Because it's, I remember it's like, how many, when I was a professional team, like how much distance are we covering each week, and how many hamstrings are we getting? Like, what's the volume? What's the volume? It's nothing to do with the volume. What about density? Now that's a cool thing. Why don't we change density of work?
Mm-hmm.
And that you
Yeah.
must get that in the from a rehab reconditioning space, because you're the reconditioning guy now, and like that density must be such a cool metric to play with in the rehab process.
For sure. I mean, that's, I think, the most misunderstood thing by a lot of coaches is just what the difference between volume, intensity, and density really is, and why you use what you use when you use it, and how you're delivering things, and what the overreaching investment is from the. I always use this analogy when I talk about athlete projects, is the bank account, the athlete bank account, and I say, an athlete has $100 of time and energy to put into the work that they do on a daily basis. And the mistake we make is we don't really have anybody managing the bank account. We just kind of go in and withdraw, So I'm a strength coach and I go, well, you need to do this. And so if somebody says to me, well, you need to make this person fit and ready to play whatever sport. And I go, okay, what's it going to take to do that? Well, $50 or 50 pounds or whatever the financial derivative you want to use.
Dodgy exchange rates, mate.
Exactly. And then and then the sports psych says I need $30, and the physio says they need $50, and the head coach that says they need $70. Well, you can see that the withdrawals far outweigh the the available cash, right? So the simple recognition of what it is you're asking somebody to do, what they have time to do, what the return on investment of what they're doing is. ROI is probably one of the biggest things that gets ignored in the supposition of training is, yeah, this might be the ideal way to train, but what is the return on investment for that? And how is it associative to everything else the person's doing, right? And so you may have to reduce your expectation based on all these other factors, right? To your point, the density of the work that they're doing, or the overreaching intensity of the work that they're doing at the time. So it gets ignored, but not only ignored, but it is a tougher part of the equation of balance and management for anybody in performance, is knowing what all the different factors are. That's why I've always liked wearing both hats, because I think one of the biggest frustrations I would run into is that, the strength coach would have this program and then the physio would have this program, and nobody's talking to each other. And meanwhile, they're doing 6 different exercises for their hamstrings, and they wonder why their hamstrings keep getting injured, because you're both giving them hamstring exercises every day, right? And it's not a strength problem, it's something else, So yeah, it's a great point. Yeah. I find the industry it doesn't spend enough time, unfortunately, just teaching people how to speak multiple languages, And so you have strength coach speak, and you have physio speak, and you have head coach speak, and everybody speaks a different language, and they don't really know how to speak the other guy's language. And so then, just like in real life, when you don't speak French and you think a Frenchman thinks of things this way, and until you speak French, you don't really understand the culture or the experience or what it is to be that, So
yeah, and that's where you get like a lot of the blame culture, lots of victimization, as well as the finger pointing.
Mm-hmm.
They're wrong, because we're all protecting our own self, and it, there's a reason why the head coach has the head coach job. He's probably really good at something really important that results in winning.
Mm-hmm.
There is something there, and the same with the physio. Everyone is, and I do believe in 99% of all cases, everyone is trying their best because they're all under the same condition of a results business.
Right.
And that's where one of my biggest learning curves was, like, I actually coached rugby. So I coached it from a technical point of view for a long time, in teams that I was working with and all that sort of stuff and playing for. But then I had the S&C side of things, and then I was brought in to do the return to play process.
Mm-hmm.
That was the best role I'd ever had. It was so much fun because of that, like speaking the languages. And then if you actually go return on investment,
Mm-hmm.
like there's a lot of the stuff that strength coaches do that has a very minimal return on investment for athletic performance.
Yeah, that's I usually, to sort of deflect the intensity of the argument or conversation, because it is what people live and die by. But I think strength coaches quite often are too attached to strength coach um, bars in which to sort of recognize their contribution in some sense, or what it is
Yeah.
that they're doing. And I sort of use the analogy of house building. First of all, you want to learn how to use all the different tools, and there are
Mm.
lots of different tools to building a house. And we're going to run into specialists who do the drywall, or I don't know what they call it in the UK, but you're going to have people who do electricity, you're going to have people who do plumbing, and those people are specialists in what they do, very good at what they do. And the contractor is the guy who brings everybody together and sort of understands the timing, the prioritization, the focus, etc. But when you get into that kind of reconditioning space, or that return to play space, you're or even when you're in a strength conditioning role with a team, versus a very specific athlete cohort in a very specific sport, your job really is to start to understand, well, I'm not a drywall specialist, but I do know that the drywall goes in at this time, and this is what's involved in it, and this is why I don't want to do this before this, and so I now start to
Mm.
understand all of that, and I start to recognize where what I do is important and where it's not important, and when I need
Mm.
to back off and when I need to come in. And I think, unfortunately, as strength coaches, we learn to, in our youth, as those professionals, strength is the focus. You know, you're learning to make people stronger, and the animals in the kitchen of that, historically, were Olympic lifting, powerlifting, bodybuilding, whatever those animals were, Russian training, etc. So all these methodological strategies for building strength were built. But
Mm.
fundamentally, what you need to understand is that's kind of like the baseline tools for delivering the outcomes of strength. But is it strength that the person needs?
Yeah.
Is it control that the person needs? Is it reactivity that the person needs? Is it their ability to, and what format of strength do they need? Do they need to absorb something? Do they need to control something? Do they need to accept something? Do they need to create impulse in something? So all these different things. And I think sometimes strength coaches get married to the outcomes of tests, because that's how
Mm.
they validate themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how they're often validated. Okay, you got this guy's vertical jump higher, or you guys got this guy's rate of force development higher, or whatever. And those are all things, those are tangibles you can point to. I've built this for this person. But when you get into
Mm.
sport, to me, you have to understand, how much does strength really implicate itself in this sport? How much is the ROI of what you're investing into that useful for that sports profile? So if you've been in the track industry, you can probably make arguments that strength has a higher relative value proposition than it would in soccer or in football, as you guys call it. Simply because in soccer, there's so many skills involved in the sport, so much tactical, technical expression that you can literally be good at it without being physically strong or physically,
Yeah.
have all the physical properties, right? So at the end of the day, then you have to look at what is the ROI for investing in this? What strength does this person need? What are their strengths, weaknesses, and what I like to call deficits? I think a lot of times people talk about weaknesses. You might have a weakness, but it's not a deficit because it doesn't matter to you in your set of circumstances. Somebody who
Yeah.
needs reactivity in one sport may not need it in another sport. And so therefore in the sport they need it in and they don't have it, that's a deficit. And if a sport doesn't require reactivity, it may not matter, right? It may be a
Yeah.
weakness in their overall profile as an athletic human, but who cares, right? So that's kind of the way I look at things. And when it comes to RTP, like, and reconditioning, which is what I do, the art of it all is just really understanding what does this individual need to do with their body and what is it they can't do right now that's getting in the way of them doing that's causing this problem, right? We tend to use strength solutions for non-strength problems.
Okay.
So
I like that.
you need to understand, is the problem being driven because the person's ability to produce force is not there?
Yeah.
Like you look at an ACL, and this might rattle some people's cages a little bit, but an ACL injury, at the end of the day, the rate at which the onset of the stress that creates the ACL tear in the first place happens is so far beyond the capacity of the muscle system to react to it. So fundamentally, you blow your ACL because your joint is not set up in the position it needs to bear the forces that are being transmitted through the system. So everything's about co-contractive energy and positional dynamics. Somebody who argues that if you get somebody stronger to solve that problem, it's not a force solution problem. You can get as strong as you want. There's no way you're going to stop, like if and I work a lot with skiers, you take a ski and put it on the bottom of your foot and have somebody tap it and try to stop them from moving it. It's impossible.
Yeah.
Too much leverage, right?
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, the only way you stop it is by being in the right place at the right time with your joints all aligned. And so it's now an organizational problem. It's not a force problem. Yes, you want to be strong, but if you're solving the problem by making somebody stronger, that's not the problem. Problem, their knee is not where it needs to be, and the joints above and below it are not where they need to be at the right time, in the right place, with the right degree of force.
Yeah.
That's kind of the way I look at it.
Yeah, I love that. There's so many similarities, because in a lot of what you're talking about there is really, good sound exercise classification, good sound special strength, dynamic correspondence. And as you were just talking about that, I love that you addressed that ACL issue, because if it's going, it's going. Like when I know someone who did it, a coach that I work with just ran playing Gaelic, second ACL, he was running alongside someone, they've run on shoulder to shoulder, caught him on the back of the knee, bang, ACL gone. It's like, well, fuck, okay, that's happened. And in the way that I teach speed is it comes from how you would, and how we approach a lot of like the RTP stuff, is that we have a framework which I use called drill stacking, which essentially is exercise stacking. So you would start segment. So you do segment, pattern, movement, and then skill. So you do like ankle segment, the ankle segment, then you would do the movement, or the that would be associated would be triple flexion, triple extension. The pattern would be first step acceleration, and the skill would be first three steps of acceleration for early acceleration. And you teach it that way. Is that similar to what you're
very
talking
similar?
about?
Actually, ours for reconditioning is parts, pathway, pattern, purpose.
Oh, well,
Or
look at
posture.
that.
I put in the middle postures, pathway, pattern, kind of as a three P's in the middle. So depending on postures, is if your athlete tends to be more static in their position. Like I work a lot with alpine skiers, so they have kind of a static tuck posture, exactly. Whereas another athlete might be very pattern centric, where they're moving in and out of certain positions, etc. So just understanding, and then going to purpose. How is the actual expression? Is there an accelerative, a decelerative, an explosive, a turnover, a repeatability, all those kinds of things that you got to look at the back end of it. Yeah, so it's very similar. Yeah,
That's so cool. So I've had some dots connect in my head there, because, well, if you're, especially the posture side of things, where, skills, like tennis, for example, like I was watching Wimbledon, and I've never really watched it, just from my own sporting history. And I think in my hand, good. If you extend my hand and I try to hit something, it's just not there. It's just not happening, right? And so, but I was watching, them warm up, and I see them doing basic A skips terribly, movement terribly. But you put the racket in their hand and they're masters. And it's like those postural cues that anchor gives them from the skill is so huge. And you look at like Novak Djokovic, his ability to exchange limbs and flip his hips is just obviously world class. It's so good, and it's like a whole area where I'm taking this into the rehab space. That could you create, with injuries, and you can create compensation, but can you create like postural tics coming back from like an ACL and stuff like that? So, and do you have to spend more time in that area?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. There's a few things to splinter off of that I think are really cool. One is, I think, like if you go back to ACLs or hamstring injuries or whatever, they get thrown into the bag of hamstring injuries or ACLs. And one of the things that's important is, did you have a traumatic ACL that occurred with a clear mechanism, or did your ACL happen kind of out of the blue when you were doing something you've done 300 million times before, right?
Yeah.
And I kind of, again, going back to my house analogy, I always look at it like this. If you got pissed off and punched a wall in your third floor apartment, and you cracked the wall, then your job to fix it is to just go and get some plaster the crack, and fill it in, because you created, that's a mechanism of injury. You know what it was. But if the crack appears just out of the blue on the third floor of your house and you plaster it, your mistake is you haven't asked the question, why is it there in the first place? It's there because your foundation's shifting. And so you can plaster it, but it'll be there again next month. And the same thing with the hamstring injury of the ACL. If I rolled over on your knee and you blew your ACL out, okay, we understand that's how you tore your ACL. Now let's get you more robust, get you moving again. But a large percentage of ACL injuries or hamstring injuries, they're happening kind of in things that people do regularly over and over again. So what changed? What's manifested? How has the body changed? What's the training program? What are all the why propositions in the background of that we're not like really getting into and diving in about, right? And that's where I like to live and breathe, is to better understand how somebody, their neurological state has changed. Are they in more threat because of life circumstances, training circumstances, all these different things, so that have changed the mechanism by which they approach movement or motion, etc. Have they had a recent injury elsewhere that they've had to compensate through, etc., etc.? And so for me, like, that comes back to, in the sort of the back end of your question, is, it was funny because you said, Sam, you're watching tennis players do A skips. So again,
Mm.
not to challenge your listener who's maybe training tennis players and does A skipping, but tell me what the fuck a tennis player does A skips for. Have you ever seen a tennis player drive their knee above their waist when they're running on the tennis court? Not at all.
No,
So
no.
why are they doing A skips?
Yeah,
Why? Like
yeah.
you can make an argument maybe earlier in their life that A skips are going to help them run better, but again, tennis players don't run for the same purpose that a soccer player runs or a
Yeah.
football player runs. They run very quickly, turn over and break to position themselves on a court. So the
Mm.
question becomes, what is in the early growth and development of a young tennis player? I want to look at them as an athlete. I want to make them a better
Mm.
athlete because I don't know that they're going to play pro tennis and they're going to be. But as they start to grow into, I've decided to specialize in being a tennis player.
Mm.
Now my warm-up strategy should be making sure that all the attributes of motion that they have to be able to access. You used the term, what was the term you used for the first part of your thing? I use parts. You said
Oh,
the
segments.
the segments. You have to make sure all the segment variabilities are available to them. So do they
Mm.
have the right amount of dorsiflexion, knee, hip motion, etc.? Can they dissociate this from this? Can they move that when they need to move this, etc.? They can do all that stuff. Now, can they, to the point of postures, pathways, etc., can they integrate it into and flow? So when they have to be turned, does their knee come with them or can their knee stay where it needs to be? Because maybe not. So if they can't, and the only way they can turn is by putting all this torque through their knee all the time, then we wonder why their knee blows up eventually on them, right? So it's all this kind of stuff that you want to start to look at. What is this and then on top of that is looking at the profile dynamics of that specific individual. So if I'm training Rafa Nadal versus Djokovic, they're two different athletes. Watch them play
Mm.
tennis.
Mm.
You bet your training program for Rafa better be different than the one for Djokovic because they don't play
Yeah,
the same.
yeah,
Rafa's a slider. That's why he's such a great, um, you know, sand court or whatever that's called, clay court tennis player. He's won the French Open, I don't know how many times. Why? Because he slides everywhere, right?
mm.
Djokovic is probably one of the best moving tennis players on earth, like just from a mechanics perspective, very high
Yeah.
quality mechanics. But he's not the French Open champion because he's not this, wacky slider style player,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
So again, what does the guy want to play? What's his strength? What are his deficits based on what he needs to do? Da 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 da. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's so cool. That's good. I love that perspective. And you're right. Like when you said about, where the literacy lies in what they're doing, this skill acquisition. And I think it was on a rare occasion a tennis player would get up to 5 steps. So you're not even finishing late acceleration.
Mm-hmm.
And so like it's just for me it opened my curiosity. It made me go, oh, I want to work with some tennis players and teach them how to fucking throw their hips about the place
Mm-hmm.
and
Well, on
be
top of that,
efficient.
not to interrupt you, but um, what is it that a sprinter can do that a tennis player can't do when they're taking those first 5 steps? A sprinter can use their arms to create that speed. Tennis player
Yeah.
better not be doing that. Where do they
No.
want their hand to be? They need to have their racket ready. So if I teach them to move first 5 steps with their arms,
Yeah.
I'm hamstringing them because now their neurological systems learn to create that speed using their arms. They actually have to do
Mm.
the reverse. They have to be very silent with their upper body and create that turnover and braking, but still be very competent with where their hand is, where their eyes are, all that sort of stuff. So we don't
Yeah.
we don't think about that enough, I think. And even when you get into some of the stuff I've been doing more recently in the last 3-4 years with applied neurology and the visual and vestibular system, I think we don't pay enough attention when we look at speed in these sports where eye checking is really an important part of what they do. Like you can
Mm.
learn to run linear like a sprinter and look downfield, but the problem is a rugby player has to be constantly eye checking while still trying to create a linear speed proposition, right?
Mm.
And so how are we bringing that into, because that's vestibular, your ability to turn your head and either focus on something or not focus on something, etc., is big interaction between eyes and your vestibular
Yeah.
system. So if you're not training that, if you're just focusing on making them faster like a sprinter, and then you want that to transition onto the field, this is why people get frustrated. Well, he's so fast when he's not with the ball. Yeah, because when he has to get the ball, all of a sudden, or when he's not focusing on the ball, he's on the track, he's super fast. But then when we put him in practice, he slows down. Yeah, because you haven't trained any of this other stuff. And all that does is go, oh, slow me down because I'm under threat. I
Yeah.
can't control this, da 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 da. We need to be able to transition that, right?
Yeah. Oh, so many big things that you pulled out of there. Like we had the you know, with a lot of the rugby players, that part of our the max velocity work that we do, and the way that we slope our intensity curves of the run, when you put a ball in their hand, it's like you can't check your feet. You can't check your feet. You're not allowed to check your feet, because there's no point in us doing this if you can't take and give a ball in stride, like if you and push it 5 meters at least. Like you have to be able to do this stuff, which is like a lot of people can't. And I think when you have there's a gray area, right? Because you have some schools of thoughts where you have people like with running with weights in their hands and rotating with weights in their hand. And for me, that kind of gets lost in class. I'm a big Bondarchuk head, so it kind of gets lost in the classification side of things. It's not quite anything, but looks okay. But why don't we just put a ball in their hand and challenge their velocities?
Yeah.
Maybe. And that with the eye tracking stuff, like my big aha moment was when I went from playing rugby to American football and posting up out on a route, and the ball is in my face by the time I've got my head round. And I said to myself, I was like, I have to learn to spot better. I had to learn a whole new skill. And my girlfriend, she's a professional dancer, and a lot of what they do is spotting. They have to spot their turns. It's like, how do you spot your turns so well? She told me. I was like, oh, that makes sense. Yeah. First practice, they just bang, bang, spot it. And then all of a sudden it's like catch. And it was nothing to do with not being able to catch. It's the skill, the neurological process, which something I want to dig into with you for the sort of next 5 minutes or so we've got left, because there must be some huge aha moments that you've had over the last 4 or 5 years that you said that you've been integrating this stuff.
Massive. I mean, one of the reasons why I went out and looked for some people to bring more applied neurology into our process was I would always talk about the movement loop and how the system manages information. So you always have inputs coming into the brain's interpreting those things, and then you create outputs. That's happening every millisecond of every day and everything you do, whether you're sitting, standing, running, doing whatever. Your main inputs, I knew, were visual, vestibular, and proprioceptive, but I really didn't know a lot of the visual and vestibular stuff. And I also didn't know about how the brain was interpreting all that information. So I was really training people from the neck down biomechanically. Yeah. And when you actually get into the literature and the information, you start to recognize that 70% of what you do from a movement perspective is determined initially by your visual system. So if you think of your visual, vestibular, and proprioceptive systems as 3 satellites that are sending information into the CPU and geolocating you all the time.
Yep.
Your visual system is primary because your whole brain's focus, absolute focus, first and foremost, is making sure you're safe. That's what your brain operates on first. After it makes sure you're safe, then it lets you perform and do stuff. But if it's not safe, it's going to save you. It's going to protect you. And so your visual system is primary. Why? Because you can see the tiger 150 meters away. If your brain is waiting for your proprioceptive system to tell you whether you're safe, you're fucking dead because the tiger's standing there with his paw in your face, right? So bottom line is your visual system is primary. Your vestibular system's telling you about where you are in from an axis of rotation and from a gravitational perspective. And so those 3 systems are always geolocating you. So when you look at your visual system, your preferred position is horizontal dynamics. Okay. So if you look at all running sports, let's take it out of sprinting, but look at all like rugby, soccer, etc., where there's change of direction. Your eyes always want to be horizontal, and they're always seeking to understand what's going on around them. The other, so I call that a non-negotiable, which is also a form of constraint. Okay. The second primary non-negotiable is your foot ground purchase position. So where your feet are and how they're angulated gives you ground purchase. You could argue that if you want to put your cleat on the ground and get a good cut, it needs to be as flat as possible. If it's up on its side, your foot's more likely to slip. So now if you take your eyes need to be horizontal and your foot needs to be flat, everything else in between is organizing itself for those two purposes. This is what we lose in translation of movement. And also movement is conic. It's not linear. So if you think of your head as the top of a cone and everything's moving around the cone like this, okay?
Yeah.
And there's also a reflex called the vestibular colic reflex, which is a reflex between our cervical muscles and our vestibula and our brain that organizes your ability to keep your head still while everything else is moving. Because what we don't realize is this can't bounce around. You can't run like that because you're not going to be able to see anything, and you're not going to be, your brain's going to go, it's going to lose it. Yeah. So everything your body does is to make this still so your eyes can see things and your brain isn't getting jiggled around.
Yeah.
When you really think about that, it's incredible what your body is doing to manage that. But that's its primary focus. So if you want to be performing and cutting and changing directions, you need to make sure your eyes and vestibular systems and proprioceptive systems are optimized, because if they're not optimized, and most of what we've learned from a medical perspective around the vestibular and visual system is when you're sick or dysfunctional, but that's not optimization. That's, okay, you have vertigo. Let's give you some vestibular exercise. Oh, you had a concussion. Let's give you some visual and vestibular exercise. What about optimization? Because I just told you those two things are primary. We don't do any of that in training. We don't give people optimization drills in the visual and vestibular system. And so if those systems are de-optimized, and your brain's not getting great information, what does your brain say? I'm under threat. Yeah. So have you ever walked, I don't, you guys don't have as nasty a winter, but when it snows, okay, let's say it snowed overnight and you walk out your front door. Do you walk out your front door aggressively and step on the snow and go for a walk? No. What do? You slow down, you control, you stiffen. That is threat dynamic, right? That's what happens to your body. That's what tension, tone, pain, inflammation, stiffness, rigidity, all these things are. They are reactions to a perception of threat. So until we recognize that we're in threat, and how are we going to dissipate threat, and how are we going to optimize those systems keep kind of reducing our profile of movement dynamic, because it says to you, I don't like what you're doing right now. You're trying to do more than you should. I'm under threat. You're not going to do that. Yeah. And that's been the biggest outcome learning for me in the last few years, is just understanding threat, understanding that the nature of relationship between your eyes and everything else in your body, and how you move. And that's why I mentioned the thing about us, we can work on speed, but if we're not working on the visual dynamics of speed, then you may be really fast, but as soon as you have to start using this, your brain will go, that's threatening. Whoa, slow down. Okay.
Yeah. That is, I think that, that's a whole conversation for another next time round. But straight away the question that comes to my head, I'm like, well, I'm thinking, I play with like the 80-20 rule. So 80% of the time you need to be doing everything that helps you improve your sport. 20 of it is the weight room type, and then 80% of that needs to be specialized, and 20% of that needs to be general. So I'm thinking, where does that fit in those models, and how can we help technical coaches engineer practices to accommodate visual optimization? And that's, I've said that out loud to then for that to go into back of my brain
Mm-hmm.
to start marinating on.
Well, and if it's even bigger now too, Sam, because of what we do, our sort of our digital discourse. You know, what are we doing most of the time now? We're staring at a computer screen or a phone, and so our visual system becomes very digitized and optimized for that and not for peripheral. And then we go, oh, okay, now I got to go on the soccer pitch and play soccer and move the ball. And we're wondering why the brain is suddenly under threat, because you've gone from sitting playing video games to now you're on the pitch again, you know. And
Yeah.
and we're never going to change that. So in some ways we almost need to visually optimize and vestibularly optimize the system before we get on the pitch. So our brain is kind of like, okay, now I'm ready to do this stuff, versus hoping it's going to catch up and wondering why we're a little bit foggy today. You know, even things like brain fog, you know, when the team comes out or the guys come out and they're just not as, they don't have the same touch on the ball, they're not moving things as well, they're not as crisp. Part of that is threat. They're under threat, and threat can be fatigue, threat can be nutrient derived, it can be a whole bunch of different things, you know. But that's what's been most interesting to me, because I think for the most part, as performance professionals, we've lived in a biomechanics stratosphere and a force development stratosphere. We don't recognize that the force dampeners, as an example, are threat. My body will not allow me to produce the force I want to produce if it feels it's being threatened.
Yeah.
And so you won't be able to jump as high, you won't be able to run as fast, you know. So it's
That's
a
awesome.
fascinating rabbit hole to start digging into, for sure.
Yeah. So, Scott, for the guys listening and girls listening, where can they, because they've probably got a lot more questions as well, where can they find you just before we wrap
Well,
up?
the stuff I teach with my wife, Jamie, is called reconditioning. You can find us at www.reconditioninghq.com. That's where all our courses are. We have 3 courses that we walk people through, and the courses walk you through how you look at movement and how you intervene. The first course is kind of looking at sort of a generalized framework of movement. The second course is looking at any movement, and the third course is playing with everything you learn plus the neurodynamics of how you learn through those 3 courses. First course is proprioceptively focused. Second course is visual and vestibularly focused, and the third course is interpretation. So I haven't even talked about how your cerebellum, your brainstem, and your cortex all work together to actually understand information. That's another podcast we can talk on.
Yeah.
But they can find me on Instagram at King O'Payne, and on Twitter at which isn't something that I do as big a deal with, but Built by Scott is my Twitter profile. And they can find me in LinkedIn too. I'm all over those places.
All over the place. That's great. That's awesome.
Plus my podcast, which you've been on, which is Leave Your Mark, and you can find me there too.
That's a great podcast. That was, and you know what? Today was really refreshing that we were able to have a conversation like we did on your podcast, which was very, very different, to then just geek out a little bit and just have fun talking about training, which is sometimes I think we had spoke about before, is that you can get a bit stale and can get a bit tiring. And this was really, really enjoyable for me. So thank you so much for your time, man.
Well, thanks for having me, man. Have a great day.